Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this last day of Translating Linguistic Minorities. And we're extremely honored to have our next guest speaker with us, Christine de Luca, who is a Scottish poet, novelist, and translator. She writes in English and Shetlandic, an Anglo-Norse dialect spoken in the Shetland Islands, Britain's northernmost extremity. Christine was born and brought up in Shetland and lives in Edinburgh. And she has always been committed to the recognition, stewardship, and international awareness of the dialects and literature of the Northern Isles. Her first poetry collections both won the Shetland Literary Prize, and she's published several others, all containing poems in both Shetlandic and in English. And her poems have frequently featured in the Scottish Poetry Library's annual online anthologies. She's also a translator and a novelist. She published a historical fiction novel in 2011, and then Forever, and two pamphlets, Drops in Time's Ocean and That Trickster's Son in 2014, which offer a reflection on her ancestors' history and contemporary Shetlandic identity. As part of her advocacy work for Shetlandic language and culture, de Luca has led several linguistic workshops on her home island and has written and translated children's books, including books by Roald Dahl and Julia Donaldson, the latter with Black and White Publishing. She's traveled internationally to create connections with other Nordic cultures, including in Iceland and in Scandinavia, and she founded the non-profit publishing house Hansel Cooperative Press, which aims to promote artistic production from the Orkney and Shetland Islands. Christine uses English as a bridge to enable communication, and she's taken part in collaborative translation events with translator poets in a range of languages, such as Portuguese, Norwegian, Danish, Icelandic, Finnish, Estonian, Latvian, Polish, Russian, Welsh, Slovenian, Frisian, Bengali, and Palestinian, hoping to foster conversations with other languages and other minority tongues in an attempt to broaden the horizons of Shetlandic literature. She was appointed as Edinburgh's Makar, which is the poet laureate from 2014 to 2017. So please welcome Christine de Luca.
Thank you so much, Cleona, and bonjour, everyone. I'm really, as I would say, just a poet, and I'm very aware that you're academics, and so you'll have to forgive me when I step over the line. Shetland is, as you can see, a tiny group of islands right up in the north of the UK, and about 100 islands. I think about 12, 13 are inhabited, and I was brought up on the west side, the west side, as we say. So it's quite a long way away. Here's Aberdeen here, and the ferry journey is 12 hours minimum, sometimes more, 13, 14 hours to get you to Lerwick. I thought I would maybe start with a poem, just to, there's a picture as well, just to get you in the mood. Lovely, it's wild scenery, wild coastal scenery. Orkney, by comparison, is quite douce and green and fertile. Shetland is mainly rugged. I thought I'd start with a poem just to get the sound in your ear. A very, very simple poem. One world at Bloemel Sound, which is a sound of water between two islands, Bloemel Sund. And it takes two birds. It's a poem about inequality and poverty and power. And the birds are the Arctic tern and the great black-back gull, which is a very predatory bird. So I'll just read it in the Shetlandic tongue, and you can follow along in English if you want. Linga is an island. Linga braks the Bloemel Sund, smooth as a nisik. Turks luft the ferry furrows, sweep backwards in circles, scouting for silks. They dive and rise in perfect verticals. Another ferry comes, and still they laugh. What strug for sic a pity pick? Along the banks of swabby tups and pinks, tripping for mid teeth that he is, he shists them till they drop their catch. He'll no fant, nor yet his kind, while Piri Turricks fish the bloomel soond. So the great black-backed gull has no ability to catch any fish at all, so it just has to predate on other little birds. So that's just to get the sound in your ear. I tend to use these terms, mother tongue, language, dialect, fairly interchangeably, which is probably very naughty. But I think, I'm not a linguist, but I see the differences between language and dialect as sometimes as much political as it is linguistic. And I think there are about 7,000 languages a day, and about half of them are endangered, which is quite a scary thought, really. I thought I'd maybe say just a little bit about Shetlandic. What is it, other than a very minority tongue? Spoken, well, in Shetland, there's about maybe 20,000 people, and I doubt if half of the people would be reasonably fluent now. There are many, many more incomers now than there were when I was being brought up there. So it is a very small group of people. A brief history. We were part of the Norse Kingdom, Norway, Denmark, for about 6 centuries, 9th to the 15th, at least that length of time. And we had Norse law, Udal law. Everybody owned their own little patch of land, and they met together and decided on things. They had the right to fish and so on. And the Earls of Norway ruled us. And then, before that, possibly Picts, I suppose. But then in the end of the 15th century, there was a Danish princess to marry a Scottish prince. Scotland was a kingdom at that time. And the Danish king didn't have enough money for a dowry, so he pawned Orkney and Shetland for this wedding. And he forgot to buy us back. So we became Scottish, you might say, by default. Then, and the Scottish law and language, Old Scots, came in slowly, probably to begin with, and I would think there was quite a bilingual environment because the language, original language, was Norn, which was a variant of Norse, something maybe like a bit like Ninorsk or Faroese, perhaps. Only tiny remnants are, we know about now. So I think there would have been a bilingual environment for some time. And then gradually the Scots, being the powerful language of the court and law and, not education at that time, the church eventually, merchants, the crown gave great tracts of land to the favourites, and you got Scottish lairds, landowners coming in and displacing people, and so on. So the language of power was Scots. And the Norn got squeezed and squashed to the margins, but it also got blended in. So what you end up with is a dialect which is related both to the Old Scots and to the Norse, if that makes some sense. So that's a very quick run through. The features of it, yes, endangered. Not so many speakers now, especially young people. And I've put a little quotation there. Once a generation of children does not learn the language anymore or only uses it in limited domain, it is very likely not survive. I'll tell you just a brief story. As a little girl, I remember speaking to an old lady who asked me, his duocalaphene, we have the familiar form of you, his duocalaphene, and I didn't know what she was talking about. So I asked my mother, and she said, it's a pencil, do you not know calaphene? And I said, no. And so it brought home to me quite immediately that the old woman knew and used the word calaphene. My mother knew it, didn't use it, and I didn't know it. So 2 generations and it's gone. Fine word, calligraphy, if you think about it. And why were we using the word pencil? It lacks official status. This is a big problem, whereas the Faroese and the Norwegians and so on have, and Gaelic have got status for their language. Even at a local level within Shetland, there's no official status. Scottish level, there's no official status. And that really affects orthography and use in the classroom, which would help transmission. It's obviously suffered a lot of attrition due to the usual things that language suffer from: changing technologies. We don't have a word for a computer. We have plenty of words for agricultural implements, peat cutting implements, for example. Urbanization, even in a little place like Shetland, about 2/3 of the population now live within 15 kilometers of Lerwick, the main town. Half the population lives in the town. That was probably, the proportion was about 1/4 of the people lived in Lerwick when I was a child. And it's in the rural areas where you get the really rich variety of language differences, regional differences, and so on. But also, in this case, a cataclysmic change in the 1970s and 80s when North Sea oil was discovered, and literally thousands of people came to the islands to work in the oil construction phase. And Sullom was at one point the biggest oil terminal in Europe. It's difficult to imagine that, but there were thousands of people who had to be accommodated. Schools had to be expanded, teachers brought in, and it was at that point that parents stopped speaking to their children in their mother tongue, or at least to a large extent. And that's a break in transmission, and we've suffered from that ever since. There are many good things about the North Sea oil development, but one of the bad things was language. A lack of policy, really. And of course, no mechanism to standardize things. But it has a very strong oral tradition. It was really mostly an oral culture. There is a literature growing for the size of the place, but not widely available, and most of it now out of print. But we do have new stuff coming in as well. We have a grammar book and fairly rich vocabulary. We don't have many abstract nouns like faithfulness or honor or things like that, but we have lots of descriptive words for mood and attitude and so on. And it's very idiomatic and quite distinct from English, which is now the main tongue, from Gaelic and Lowland Scots. It gets, as you'd imagine, little attention in education. Education now, the curriculum is so full, there's no time for extras. Little attention in the media. It's easily marginalised even within Shetland, and certainly within Scotland, and somewhat isolated. To tell you a little bit about my work, translating Shetlandic, first of all, into other languages, my own personal experience. I'm a typical Brit, linguistically challenged, schoolgirl French, nursery school Italian, perhaps. I can, when I look at Norwegian, I can make sense of it, but when I listen to it, I struggle. So very typical in that respect. But I found that the language across frontiers, and actually the European Union, has been very instrumental in helping the small marginal places of Europe to be together and to do things and translation workshops together. So sometimes it's face-to-face workshops, which is the best of all, but more recently, of course, we have to be online. And out of that, or beyond that, in fact, beyond that have come some bilingual collections of my poems, which really surprised me. The first one was a French one, and that was just by chance. Jean-Paul Blot of Éditions Fédérop, I can't even say it with my proper he found some of my poems online. He was wanting to do a translation of a Scottish poet, so he decided to do some poems of mine, which was brilliant. And then I've had one in Italian, and now Icelandic and Norwegian. And more recently, a woman in down south wanted me to do an English one. So I did my own translations there. And lots of other languages which Cleona mentioned. Always English is used as a bridge text. It is very useful. Face-to-face is always best, but I usually send sound files, and we have lots of emailing and phoning. English is capacious and many, many meanings and quite a lot of subtlety in it. And of course, it's widely spoken. So I couldn't do this work if it weren't really for that. I thought I'd give you a couple of little snippets. This is just to show you the place. This is the simplest of poems, and I'm only going to give you a couple of little haiku type stanzas. It's called The Door Hum. Home is it's just a little rocky island off the coast, and you can see why it's called a door home. But if you see it from different angles and in different lights, I mean, it's sometimes like a cat, sometimes like a dinosaur, sometimes it's like a door. And this is in St. Magnus Bay, and the sword that killed St. Magnus comes to mind. And sometimes it's like a couple dancing, and so on. So these are just a couple of little snippets, and they were translated by the Icelandic writer Adelstein Asberg Sigurdsson, who was a wonderful man I met in a workshop, and he has his own publishing house and writes prose and poetry. So this is the Icelandic translation, and this is the Shetland one. Asianas battle scarred, a shield of skerries, headbutts the Atlantic. The hum opens a door onto St. Magnus Bay, a sword through the heart. So not lots of borrowed words from English, but different pronunciation, a sword through the heart. And you can see Sverdi lagt hjarta, and we have the word hjarta, which means my dear, my dearest. So it's the same meaning. But of all the languages that I've been translated into, I think Icelandic somehow is somehow sound-wise, and the compactness of it seems to have that same kind of muscularity and the same fierceness and softness as that Shetlandic has, the rise and flow. So I find that quite interesting that it has that. Here's another tiny little snippet. It's not particularly good poetry, but I thought it maybe showed it up. This is Nynorsk, and that's the Western Norway. That's the older, although it's called New Norwegian, it's actually the older form of Norwegian. You probably know that. And it has an affinity as well, a strong affinity in sound and in rhythm. And I wrote this poem. It's a longish poem, Song for the Time Travelers, and it's just a little 2 lines about each group of people. The Pict starts with the Picts and the Vikings, and then the Scots, and then the lairds and the ministers and all the kind of people with power coming in, and then it goes on to the oil workers and all the shades of faith groups that come in, and tinkers and all kinds of people coming in. And of course, the modern migrants too. And in each case, they get a couple of lines and then a little refrain, a little chorus. And each time I pick a bird that seems to suit that particular group. So probably for the lairds, I probably had the great black-backed gull or something like that. But for this is the ministers of the religion with their Geneva gown, their black gown and their white trim. And the oyster catcher was the bird I chose for them. Very, very smart bird with their black and white. So in English, it's the oyster catcher, long-beaked and garrulous, black and white plumage, well-dressed. Shoulders lang-nabbed, lang-winded, black and white feathers, wheel-rigged. Shoulder, lang-nabbed, lang-pistre, svart og hvitt I fjøra, viltkleide. And I could have said viltkleid. We would say that too, but I used rigged for dressed because it kind of rhymed with winded. But I could have said vilkleida. So almost identical, you can see there in that little snippet. Not particularly poetic, but perhaps just an example. And comments from these translators, they say, this is like a cousin. It's like a missing link. And they're understanding it as much from their knowledge of their own language as they are from their knowledge of English, which is always very good. And when they compare their language to, say, like Norwegian to Danish or Swedish, or they see more difference between Shetlandic and Standard English as they do between their own languages, which makes you think, doesn't it? About the politics of language. And sometimes when they've been translating my poems, maybe it's just something about me, but they say, you know, that reminds me of something my granny used to say. And they're reaching back to a dialect they've perhaps lost. Standardization has sometimes had a negative effect. And they're looking for an equivalent word, an equivalent concept that they've maybe lost, or an idiom. And even a Welsh poet I worked with, she was doing the same thing. An Italian poet I was working with was doing the same thing. And I mean, I have no explanation for it, but I thought that was kind of interesting. Then working the other way, translating other languages into Shetlandic. And some people say, what's the point in that? You know, there's such a tiny market. And always again with the help of a bridge. But I think for people in Shetland, it's important for them to see that their own little tongue can stand up to that kind of scrutiny. And it's done in the same kind of range of languages. But I thought I'd just mention 3 more recent projects, more substantial projects that have allowed me to sort of showcase Shetland. The first one, just a few years ago, was a commission from Edinburgh Book Festival, which is a big international book festival, and they were having 4 translation pieces. There was Antigone, and there was Serena de Bergerac in Scots, and so on. And they were short of a 4th one, so they wondered if I would do something for a 90-minute performance in Shetlandic. And I thought, how am I going to entertain a tent of maybe a couple of hundred people in Shetlandic for 90 minutes? So I had thought, well, I have to get a good story to start with. And possibly I asked if I could bring in a Shetland fiddler, Shetland violinist, traditional fiddler. And so I got the go-ahead for that. And I chose 4 stories from the Finnish classic, the Kalevala, which I love. And they're just origin stories, the same as in so many cultures, of course. And because the names of people were difficult, like Vainamoinen and things like that, I got the fiddler to create little motifs for each of the characters. So that helped the audience know who was speaking and so on. And I gave them a little help at the beginning of each story as to what was happening. And strangely enough, 2 Finnish friends at the end of it said to me, that's the best Kalevala I've heard. I think they learned it at school and ploughed through it, you know, and perhaps the school experience, of course, is different. And this was just a bit more fun and a bit different. More recently, just this year, I've been involved in translating, this will be outside in, but a book, I did the 3rd of it, and there were 2 other Scots poets involved. And this was the enduring one I did by a Chinese poet, Jiri Majai. I'm not quite sure how to say that name, but he is a well-known poet in China, writing in an old minority tongue of China. So we still haven't done any events in that, but it's beautifully produced with the Chinese characters at the back of the book, and the English and the translation at the front of the book. So it's a trilingual. And just very, very recently, hot off the press, a pamphlet of poems by the Portuguese poet Eugenio de Andrade. It's a trilingual as well. And there I've tried to catch the sound patterns if I could, and the English versions, beautiful English versions by Alexis Leviton. Getting the permissions is an absolute pain, I have to say, but I managed to get them. And that's the cover. It's a sort of a poetry art booklet. And I thought I would just put this up on my screen. It's one poem from this with the Portuguese on the there. This is not how it's set out. It's set out beautifully with the Portuguese in a Portuguese typeface, the English in an American English typeface, and the Shetlandic in a Scots typeface. And there's art and whatever as well. But this is me just sticking on the PowerPoint for you. But in English, I've picked out the words which are different, the vocabulary from English. And in pink there, I've highlighted it where the grammar is a bit English, a bit different from English. We have a lot of borrowed words, obviously, a lot of loan words, but we do have some grammatical differences, and we have gendered nouns as well, which English doesn't have. So I'll just read it to you in the Shetland tongue, and then you can watch it in English or so on. Fidegrund, it's a kind of a love poem, I suppose. Fidegrund, the skin is silence, sighs, no that night bloods at their shackle bains, brings close the nunnen at I white rain. Simmer swander someway out by, the sharp stink of deadly nightshade blinds the earth. Blind too, the mouth trivels for the works of love, but finds only the shadowy knot of words. Words, where one cry would be an yacht, the creash of words come me vermish for what's vive, right now, purest sap, the deepest dubes of thy body, bow, arrow, crown of water open to the prunk arder of me body. For the grund to the heights, seas do the strands, had I wished, lady doen, and under me hawks, de earth boon, no born, no. Oh. It's a bit naughty, but there you go. But you can see it's quite reflexive. I can't see what's going on here. Let me have a look. Seas do the strands, lay didun, lay yourself down, hold your quiet. It's a bit like French, je me couche, and so on. So English doesn't have that. So that's just a little sound again, and you see some differences. I've had great fun translating children's classics. Why make up stories when there are some really good ones to translate? And Roald Dahl's George's Marvelous Medicine was fun, and I did free sessions around all the primary schools with children, and managed to raise some money to give them some free books. And more recently, I was asked if I would do The Gruffalo's Child and the Troll by Julia Donaldson, and that was great too. For adults, other than poetry pamphlets and so on, and in my own poetry books, but I've enjoyed doing some Shakespeare's sonnets just to show the range of things that the dialect can cope with, and the Kalevala stories. And we have, as a little cooperative, published Villon, his poetry, and you'll know his poetry, old French poetry, by a man called Bill Tate, who's been dead a long time, and his manuscript had been lying in the archives for so long, so we managed to publish that with some art, and that was Le Testament. And also some Lorca translations by a young Shetland poet. Getting to the end, strands of hope, yes, definitely strands of hope. We have our grammar, and that's a good beginning. In fact, one of the Scots students wrote a Scots grammar based on the Shetland grammar, using that as a model. We have several dictionaries, we have online resources. We have a wonderful group of volunteers who since 2004 have been trying to stem the tide, Shetland Forwards for Words, and they have a good website, and they've created materials for schools, taken them out to schools. They continue to do that. They've encouraged, if I need help to do something, they're very encouraging. They respond to researchers. They get involved in various projects, put on concerts and so on. So they really do work hard, and all voluntary. And really, I do think now it is paying off. For a long while, young people were speaking a kind of a mid-Atlantic drawl, and that seems to be changing. And I think social media is helping there because it's informal and they don't worry about their spelling. Sometimes it gets a bit iffy, I think, a bit mongrel in captioning their Instagrams if they're a bit drunk, but never mind. It's now the subject of research, things like that, and that's good too. It is a very socially inclusive dialect. There's no stigma attached to speaking it, unlike a lot of Scots. It's for everyone. And it has had a long interest in poetry, which has probably come from the kind of ballad past and the saga past. It's quite onomatopoeic and a lot of assonance. So I think for poets, that's a great thing. And as I said, very idiomatic. European universities have been taking it seriously, which is great. And at last, I think Scottish universities are starting to think about it. Small literature, but definitely growing, including now for children, which never was the case really. And as writers, of course, we can, as language decays, we can find new ways of using words in new contexts. So it's a policy vacuum. There's no policy, for example, about education, unlike, for example, Gaelic, which is a very, very strong policy-driven language. So the writers, the translators have to become absolutely ambassadors, activists, stewards, role models, and embrace these roles and find young people willing to come on behind you and keep going. But I think seeing your own little dialect or language respectfully translated by people from major linguistic areas of the world, and conversely being able to read work in other languages, translate it into their little language, I think it's good for everyone involved, and raises the status of their mother tongue, and this demonstrates it's not just for the shuggy banes of this world. Much as I admire the writing of demotic Scots, I think there is a place for other versions of Scots. And so the onus is on us to build it up. This is the last slide, I think, near enough. Lack of recognition within Scotland leads to a lack of resources. I mean, Gaelic and Lowland Scots get huge funding and we get none, basically. And especially someone like me who's not living there, if I apply to Shetland for something, well, you're living in Edinburgh. If I'm trying to apply in the capital for something to do in Shetland, they're saying, well, you're talking about Shetland, so you're between two stools. It's not financially viable because the print runs are so tiny. So you have to be quite clever in the ways you do things. Recently, this is an interesting thing, more controversially, I think, a recent interest in dialect as an artifact, as a resource for writers in English. I have no problem with that if it's respectfully done and perhaps italicized and shown to be a loan word in the same way as I would loan a word from French or whatever if I was needing to do it. But there is a kind of allure of the liminal, the remote, and pepper your poem with just one little cute word or one or two little cute words, and that makes it a little bit distinctive. I find it slightly colonial. I may be very touchy about this. An attitude to the native, a bit of gentrification and cultural appropriation. But I think it's worth thinking about at least. And I picked up on a piece of research at a university. The Arts and Humanities Research Council was funding delocalizing dialect. We are especially interested in viewing and doing dialect against its own deep associations with geographical locality and social rootedness, and attending to its qualities of disruption, experiment, and autonomy. I don't know what that means in reality, but I don't know that anybody speaking a dialect was involved in setting up the program, and if they're going to be delocalizing Shetlandic, I'll be at their throats and asking them why and how and what. And maybe there's some good reasons for doing it, but I really want to know. So all the more reason to write in and create new literary work in the authentic dialect. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to try and answer questions if you have them.
Thank you very much, Christine, for a very fascinating paper. I noted a number of words and expressions. What you were talking about, hoodie wished, and it reminded me of an expression in Irish English, which is hold your wished. When
really?
You want somebody to stay quiet. Yeah.
How do you wish?
The other thing that I was struck by was the connection between what you were talking about in general terms and a book by a man called John Kerrigan, who talks about archipelagic English. And in this idea of archipelagic English, you notice it straight away from the cover of his book, where he has the islands, which were formerly known as the British Isles, turned on their side. And he has all of the islands on the top streaming out. Yeah. And it looks as if, so first of all, it's a decentered version of those islands. And it's highlighting the importance of variety via these streaming islands and their hair. And I wondered what you thought about that concept of archipelagic English. I think archipelagic language, for instance.
I think it's very interesting, and it reminds me also of the polar centered map. When you look down on the world from the poles, and if you take the North Pole and you look down on it, then somewhere like England and Britain is on the edge. And you get Greenland and Iceland and Faroe and Shetland and Orkney and Norway and Denmark and right bang, you can see how the Vikings moved, and you see a different center for your world. And we've got so used to the kind of Mercator maps where it's distorted, the world is distorted. And it's lovely seeing a map of the world from another vantage point, any other vantage point. So we kind of soften up and loosen up our views of center and periphery, because center and periphery thinking is so strong, and it's usually urban, rural as well. But I do like that idea of the streaming hair, and yes, these islands have linguistic gems.
Absolutely. I know that Claire Ellie would like to ask you a question, so Claire, over to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
I can, yes.
Thank you very much, Christine de LUCA, for this wonderful, wonderful talk. That was really fantastic. Thank you very much. So I wanted to ask you a question about parallel words.
Oh, yes.
I noticed that, well, in this book, you have poems in Shetlandic and poems in English. And I noticed that there was a huge effort to mediate the Shetlandic poems for an English audience. There are translations, there's a glossary, well, lots of things are done. But there's not much for the Shetlandic audience to get the English poems. And so I was wondering whether this was, a request from the publishing house, or if this was a way for you to show that, after all, these parallel words are not that parallel.
Well, everybody in Shetland is an English speaker, really. So it's a totally bilingual environment. That is the language of school. And actually, when I was a kid, going off target here, when I was a kid, the problem was really to get children to speak grammatical English. And that was a problem, and making sure they could. So everybody can speak English. So that's not so much an issue. That was the first collection I had published on the mainland. First three were in Shetland, so that was no problem. Well, probably get anything published, but that was less of a problem. This was the first one that I managed to get an Edinburgh publisher to take on. And when he opened it, he said, the manuscript, he said, "I thought to begin with you were West Indian." Because my husband's name is of Italian origin, so he had no clue as to where I came from, and he was quite confused. But he was very good, and he was willing to listen. And but he insisted I write an introduction about it, which is probably a wise idea. And so I thought it was wise to gloss the Shetland poems to try and help people understand, because I want people to understand, get something out of it, you know. But I don't think they need any help with the English, no. Maybe I'm wrong.
Thank you, Christine. There's another question from Ruggero Bianchin, who wants to know if you're familiar with the Scottish National Dictionary and if you think it may be useful to translators who translate Shetlandic and poems in other varieties of Scots into their own language, particularly if they're unable to communicate directly with the authors.
That's a good question. The Scots National Dictionary, which I have somewhere, it's a big, big thing. The problem, there's a lot of poetry being translated in Scotland even by people who don't have the Scots tongue of any kind, really, naturally in their ear, and they're using dictionaries. And I call it dictionary dredged poetry. It doesn't really come over smoothly, and when they read it, it's fun. There was one woman asked me to read her poems for her, you know, and I thought, well, how bizarre is that? This was written in a kind of semi-lowland Scots. She was an English speaker, and I can't naturally, I mean, I can understand lowland Scots, but I don't have it in my ear. And I said, to be honest, I really don't think I can do this justice. And anyway, it was sort of not terribly authentic. So I think there are huge problems. I think you need to find someone to work with who has that in their ear and can help you. I'm a little bit unsure about just sitting down and doing it just with a dictionary. I think you need more than that, but it's a good start.
I'm reminded when you talk about about authenticity of an Irish poet called David Wheatley, who moved to Aberdeen. He teaches at the university there. And his most recent collection is called The President of Planet Earth. And what I think is interesting there is the approach of his publisher, because in the past he was being published by an Irish publisher, Gallery Press, which is owned and run by Peter Fallon. And when he presented this manuscript, President of Planet Earth, so much was written in Scots that I think Gallery felt that it wasn't perhaps authentic, or it wasn't the right fit. So he was published by a different publishing house. And what he has done for the poems that he has written in Scots is he has the words shaded, particularly I think in what you talked to us about. You noted the fact that it's proper nouns very often that are different. And so he had the word in Scots in a darker, bold print.
Right.
And the translation in the margin.
Right, yeah.
And that allowed you to move between the two, which was an interesting approach.
Yeah, I think also what's needed for academia and what's needed for the general reader, sometimes kind of different. And I think my main attention has been for local people, just for ordinary people, the bus driver, the postman, you know, just people who are speaking it, and to help them realize that what they have is worth having. It's not, you know, and so that's my focus, rather than and trying to meet both targets is quite tricky sometimes. I mean, at the moment, I've got a new collection coming out and published in Edinburgh by a different publisher, and we're talking about how to gloss things. And we're looking at, you know, my typical way was below the poem and how much to gloss. And I quite like it down the side if I'm doing it, but he finds it cluttered, you know. So just our highlighting or whatever. And one thing I did with the English collection, the full bilingual Shetland poems, only Shetland poems, and then a version by me in English, is I got the publisher to put them in a slightly lighter typeface so that people would, although they might only read the English to start with, they would realize that that's not the real poem. This is the real poem because it's paler, a sort of pale reflection of the real thing. So trying to think of ways of helping people, but making them realize that what the real poem is, it's quite a tricky job.
I think it's interesting as well that you talk about the fact that Shetlandic lacks an official status. And you've raised the question of, I suppose, the politics of language.
Yeah.
I wondered if you care to address that, why it is that there is no, I suppose, person lobbying for the official status of Shetlandic.
Well, if you go back to the tail end of the 1800s, about 1890, the linguist Jacob Jacobsen from Faroe visited, and he collected the Norn remnants, or the words he heard being spoken, which were of Norn origin, and he came up with two huge, I'll get to them, dictionaries.
They're wonderful.
Yeah, wonderful. 10,000 words, I think, roughly, of and their origins, and really well researched. And I can still think of words today that are of Norn origin that are not in there. So, and he was saying to the Shetlanders at that time, come on, you need to get yourselves organized. The Faroese have got themselves organized and got legal status and so on. But it kind of didn't engage somehow. I think people were just too busy making ends meet, and some were more interested in the kind of literary aspects of things, and trying to get a group of people to organize themselves. And the political leaders weren't interested in that at all. They were busy on infrastructure and all that kind of stuff. And there was not much money. It was a poor society. And there have been one or two forays into thinking about it, but I actually think that now, and in fact, at the last Shetland Forwards meeting, which was an online one, and so I could take part in it, which was wonderful, they were talking about it again. And I wonder if there might be another opportunity to do something about it. It's a bit late in the day, but not impossible. I think if we could get some policy about schooling, that would be a big help.
Okay. Bruno Poncharal has a question for you. Bruno, over to you.
Yeah.
Hello.
Well, hello, Christine, and thank you for your fascinating talk. I have a question about your own translation of your own poems.
Yeah.
In other words, self-translation. How do you deal with that? What happens in your head? I mean, in your two selves or two aspects of the same person. It's
an interesting one, really, and kind of difficult to do. And I've got to make up my mind whether meaning is what I'm trying to convey as much as anything else. I mean, I'm still saying to myself, the poem is the original poem. This is a version to help people understand it. If I were to veer more towards, well, let's make this a really good English poem in English, that would be a different decision. So I tend to stay on the side of helping the reader understand. I try to make it, sound half decent, but it's definitely, that's where my priority lies. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's quite clear. Thank you.
Okay, I just wanted to conclude with this idea of you saying it's too late in the day. And I wondered whether there was any project afoot to record people. You gave us the very interesting example of the word caliphon, and saying that within the grandmother, the mother, and you, the term was lost. And I suppose this idea of recording speakers would be a way of storing the word hoard. Are there any projects of that nature afoot?
I don't know there's that many, not big projects that I'm aware of. There's lots of little bits and pieces. I think this is often the thing. You do find bits and pieces. And actually the School of Scottish Studies in Edinburgh, they've been active over the years in recording. Often it's music, traditional music and things like that. But, and I think the local archives would have stuff as well. But there's not been, I don't think, a really big project to do things like that. I think realize that it's being eroded, and by the time they sort of realize it's, you think, well, it's too late. What do we do now? Yeah. But
I think one of the things that you referred to was you talked about the European Union, and you said about how Europe was so good for things like that.
Yes.
And I think that this idea of the protection of the minorities and the minority languages, which was enshrined in organizations, for instance, like Euroschool, which enabled children from all of these minority languages to get together, was really very valuable. So we have one last question from Amy Lyle, who says that it was wonderful to hear you featured a fiddle alongside one of your performances. Do you think that traditional music and poetry performance is effective in animating minority languages and cultural identities today?
I think so. I think the art forms have a lot to offer one another, and they sort of bolster one another. I've just been asked by a jazz saxophonist, it's not particularly traditional, to work on a project. I think there'll be 4 poets and 4 traditional musicians and the Jazz Orchestra of Scotland. So that'll be fun, and it's based on mythology. And I think bringing language, and you also bring 2 audiences together, and that's a good thing. You bring people who might not have come to something to do with poetry or language to the thing, and that way it opens it out even more. So I think music has a lot to offer, and traditional music as well. And Shetland has a very, very lively traditional music scene, mostly fiddles.
Okay. Thank you very much, Christine, for this wonderful session, which was so inspiring. And we look forward to reading your next collection.
Well, it's called Vive, which means vivid.
Excellent.